I froze just outside my mother's dining room when I heard her whisper, "Wait until Teresa leaves. Then change the locks." My own brother answered, "She'll never see it coming." Change the locks on what? Why was there a brand new key ring beside an envelope from the Franklin County Recorder's office? And why had my phone just received a notification that someone was trying to update the insurance policy on the house I'd spent years quietly helping maintain? I didn't walk back into that room. I didn't confront either of them. I picked up my purse, smiled goodbye, and drove away, knowing one thing for certain: whatever they were planning was much bigger than locking me out of a house. If you're listening from somewhere in the world today, tell me your country and what time it is where you are. I'd love to know who's sharing this story with me. And if you've ever discovered a family secret by staying silent instead of speaking, first subscribe and stay with me. You'll understand why I said nothing that day. The first thing I did Monday morning wasn't call my mother. It wasn't call my brother either. I opened my laptop before the first meeting on my calendar, set my coffee beside it, and reread the insurance notification that had come through while I was pulling away from my mother's house. A request has been submitted to update the homeowner's insurance policy. Additional verification may be required before changes can be processed. Most people would have ignored a message like that. I couldn't. I've spent nearly 15 years working as a senior risk analyst for one of the country's largest banks. My job isn't glamorous. I don't negotiate billion-dollar mergers or appear on financial television. I investigate inconsistencies. I look for patterns that don't belong. My entire career has been built around one uncomfortable truth. Fraud rarely begins with a dramatic crime. It begins with someone assuming no one is paying attention. That notification bothered me because of its timing. Not the day before, not last week. Minutes after I'd overheard my mother telling Brandon to change the locks. Coincidences happen. Clusters of coincidences deserve investigation. I enlarged the notification and read every line again. The request hadn't been approved yet. That mattered. Insurance companies don't simply accept changes because someone asks. Depending on the circumstances, they often verify occupancy, ownership, or authority before modifying coverage. Someone had tried. Someone hadn't finished. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the office window. Downtown Columbus looked exactly as it always did on Monday mornings. Traffic inching forward, people carrying coffee, construction crews already working. Meanwhile, my own family was apparently trying to rearrange something behind my back. At 10 o'clock, my manager walked into the conference room for our weekly meeting. I participated. I presented my reports. I answered questions. If anyone noticed that I barely touched my coffee, they were polite enough not to mention it. The moment lunch arrived, I shut my office door and opened the Franklin County Property Records website. The address appeared immediately. The owner listed was exactly who I expected. Evelyn Peters. No surprises there. The property tax status looked current. No liens, no foreclosure notices. Nothing unusual. Then one small line caught my attention. Recording status pending. I frowned. Pending property records don't usually display that unless documents have already been submitted but haven't officially been recorded. I clicked for more details. Very little information was publicly available. Only a filing date and the name of the law office that had submitted the paperwork. I copied it into my notes. My stomach tightened. Yesterday afternoon, my mother had been discussing changing locks. This morning, there was a pending property filing. Neither proved anything. Together, they created a question I couldn't ignore. I reached for my phone but stopped before dialing my mother's number. What exactly would I ask? "Hi, Mom. I overheard you plotting something behind my back." No. If she was hiding something, warning her would only give her time to clean it up. Instead, I called someone who understood evidence better than emotion. Olivia Carter answered on the second ring. Tell me you aren't working through lunch again. I wish. She laughed. What happened? I need a favor. You sound serious. I think my family may be trying to transfer property without telling me. Silence. Not the confused kind. The analytical kind. Start from the beginning, she said. So I did. I told her about Sunday dinner, about hearing my mother's voice through the hallway, about Brandon, about the locks, about the envelope from the county recorder, about the insurance notification. When I finished, Olivia didn't rush to reassure me. That was one of the reasons we'd remained friends for nearly 12 years. She respected facts more than feelings. What have you confirmed? Only that there's a pending filing. What have you assumed? That it involves the house. Good, she replied. Separate those two and don't mix them. I smiled despite everything. That sounded exactly like her. She had spent almost a decade as in-house counsel for our bank before moving into compliance leadership. Whenever people panicked, Olivia organized. When can you get the actual filing? She asked. I don't know. Call the recorder's office. I searched for the number while we stayed on the phone. The clerk explained that copies could be requested in person the following morning because the documents hadn't been fully indexed yet. I thanked her. Olivia spoke before I could. Go. I plan to. And Teresa, yeah, don't confront anyone tonight. I hesitated. You think they'll hide something? I think people reveal more when they believe they're ahead. I wrote that sentence down, not because I needed to remember it, because I knew it was true. After work, I drove home instead of stopping by my mother's house like I sometimes did on Mondays. The apartment felt strangely quiet. I opened a storage box labeled House Expenses. Most people probably wouldn't have kept records going back nearly 10 years. I did. Old habits from banking. Every major payment had been scanned. Roof replacement, new furnace, plumbing emergency, foundation repairs, annual property taxes, insurance reimbursements, window replacement after a storm. I hadn't paid every bill, but I'd paid far more than anyone outside the family would ever guess. Not because anyone forced me, because after Dad died, Mom struggled financially. Brandon was still trying to get his contracting business off the ground. I had the stable salary. Helping seemed obvious. At first, it had been small things. Replacing a broken water heater, covering an unexpected tax bill, paying for tree removal after a storm, then bigger things. A leaking roof became an entirely new roof. An aging HVAC system became a full replacement. Every time I offered help, Mom said almost the same thing. I'll never forget what you're doing for this family. Back then, I believed her. I wasn't buying ownership. I wasn't keeping score. I was protecting the place where every Thanksgiving, every Christmas morning, every birthday dinner had happened. The house wasn't an investment to me. It was where Dad had taught Brandon and me to ride our bikes, where he'd marked our heights on the kitchen doorway, where he'd stayed awake all night helping me build my 8th grade science project. Selling memories wasn't something I ever imagined my family would consider. A soft chime interrupted my thoughts. An email. Not from my mother. Not from Brandon. From the Franklin County Recorder's Office. Your request has been scheduled. Documents will be available for review tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. I stared at the confirmation. Tomorrow, less than 24 hours away. Then another notification appeared. This one wasn't an email. It was a text from Brandon. Hey, Mom says you seemed quiet yesterday. Everything okay? I looked at the screen for a long moment. If he knew I'd overheard them, he was an excellent actor. If he didn't, then he believed I was still completely in the dark. I typed 3 simple words. Everything's fine. He responded almost immediately. Good. Love you, sis. I set the phone face down without answering. For the first time in my life, those words didn't bring me comfort. They sounded like part of a conversation whose ending I hadn't been allowed to hear. Tomorrow morning, I was finally going to read the documents everyone else seemed to assume I'd never see. I arrived at the Franklin County Recorder's office 20 minutes early, not because I was eager, because I needed those 20 minutes to convince myself I wasn't overreacting. Government buildings have a way of making ordinary moments feel heavier than they are. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, quiet conversations, people waiting with folders tucked under their arms. Everyone looked like they belonged there. I felt like someone walking toward an answer I wasn't sure I wanted. At exactly 9:30, a woman behind the records counter smiled politely. "Good morning. Can I help you?" "Yes," I said, sliding over the confirmation email on my phone. "I'm here to review a pending recording for this property." She checked my identification, typed for a few seconds, then disappeared through a secured door. When she returned, she carried a thick manila folder. "These are still pending," she explained. "Nothing has been officially recorded yet."
"Can I make copies?"
"Yes." She placed the folder in front of me. "Please don't remove the documents from this room." I nodded. As soon as she walked away, I opened the folder. The first page was routine. Property information, parcel number, legal description. Nothing unusual. The second page made my pulse quicken. Quit claim deed. Grantor Evelyn Peters. Grantee Brandon Peters. My stomach tightened. I kept reading. If the document were eventually recorded, my mother intended to transfer the house to Brandon for $10 and other valuable consideration. $10. A legal phrase. Not the real value. The actual value of the property was close to $600,000. I slowly turned the page. Signature. Evelyn's. Not notarized yet. Another page. Instructions prepared by a small local law office. Another. Transfer tax exemption. Another. Draft recording sheet. Then nothing. The file simply stopped. I frowned. There should have been more. The recorder's office doesn't accept incomplete transfers. Something essential was missing. I looked back through the stack. Again. And again. Still nothing. I walked back to the counter. "Excuse me?" The clerk looked up. "Yes." "Is this everything?" She glanced at the folder. "Yes." "It feels incomplete." She smiled. "That's because it is." "What do you mean?"
"The attorney submitted preliminary documents, but we issued a deficiency notice."
"A deficiency," she nodded. "They're missing required supporting documentation." "What kind?"
"I'm sorry, I can't give legal advice."
"I'm not asking for advice." She hesitated. "Let's just say they cannot record this transfer until certain issues are resolved." That wasn't the answer I wanted. But it was enough. Someone had tried to move quickly. They hadn't succeeded. Not yet. I thanked her, paid for copies, and walked outside carrying a folder that suddenly felt much heavier than paper should. Instead of driving away, I crossed the street to a small coffee shop. Olivia was already there. She stood when she saw me. "Well?" I handed her the copies. She didn't speak for nearly 5 minutes. She simply read. Finally, she looked up. "This is worse than I expected." "Worse. They've already prepared everything. But they haven't finished." "No." She pointed to the final page. "They can't." I leaned closer. "There should be an affidavit confirming Evelyn understands the legal consequences of the transfer."
So it's missing. Maybe they forgot."
Olivia looked at me over the top of the papers. "Law firms don't usually forget required documents." She turned another page. "They're also missing something else." "What?" She slid one document toward me. Near the bottom was a familiar name. Mine. Not as an owner, not as a buyer, just one sentence. Notice provided to interested family member. I blinked. "What does that mean?" It means whoever prepared this believed someone in the family should receive notice. I never did. I know. She continued reading, then she stopped. Her expression changed. What? Teresa. She pointed to a small section near the bottom, notice mailed to an address. I stared at it. My old apartment? The one I'd moved out of almost 3 years earlier. I felt cold. No. Olivia checked again. No what? They know I don't live there. How? My mother helped me move. I remembered it immediately. She had spent an entire Saturday unpacking kitchen boxes with me. She knew my address better than anyone. Brandon had been there too. He'd carried my sofa upstairs. Both of them had visited dozens of times afterward. There was no possibility this was an honest mistake. Olivia didn't rush to agree. She simply asked, "Has anyone from your family ever mailed you anything at your current address?" Of course. Birthday cards? Yes. Christmas? Yes. So they know where you live? I nodded slowly. They absolutely know. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The noise of the cafe seemed very far away. Coffee grinders, people laughing, a baby crying somewhere behind us. Meanwhile, my entire understanding of what had happened shifted. Yesterday, I'd believed my family might simply be making a bad decision. Now I had to consider something much worse. Someone had taken steps that practically guaranteed I would never receive notice before the transfer became official. Olivia folded her hands. I'm going to ask you something. Okay. If this transfer had gone through, I finished the sentence for her, they would have changed the locks. She nodded. And by the time you found out, Brandon would already own the house. I looked back at the paperwork. The words blurred for a moment, not because I was crying, because I suddenly remembered something so ordinary that I'd ignored it for years. Every January property tax bills arrived at my apartment. Not because I owned the house, because Mom had asked me to receive them. She always said she traveled too much to trust the mail. I paid them online, then mailed her the confirmation. If she wanted to reach me, she knew exactly where I lived. I slowly reached into my folder. The clerk had included something else. A printout of filing activity, submission date, correction notice, communication log. One line immediately caught my attention. Deficiency notice mailed to submitting attorney. Another. Courtesy notice mailed to interested family member, then a tracking number. Olivia leaned closer. That's useful. Why? If we can determine where that letter actually went. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Evidence. Not assumptions. Evidence. Just then my phone buzzed. Mom. I stared at the screen until the call stopped. Seconds later, another message appeared. Sweetheart, are you free for dinner Wednesday? Brandon wants to talk about something important. I read it twice, then 3 times. Talk about something important. The transfer wasn't finished. The locks hadn't been changed. Yet they wanted another family dinner. Olivia quietly sipped her coffee. What are you thinking? I looked back at the folder. I'm thinking... I paused. They don't know the recorder's office rejected their paperwork. Olivia raised an eyebrow. Or, they think I still have no idea any of this exists. For the first time since Sunday afternoon, I realized silence wasn't just protecting me anymore. It was revealing them. And somewhere between my mother's invitation to dinner and the paperwork spread across our table, one question refused to leave my mind. If they were willing to send legal notices to an address they knew I had left years ago, what else had they been quietly keeping from me all this time? I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was angry. Anger would have been easier. I kept replaying ordinary memories, trying to figure out when they had stopped being ordinary. Every Christmas when Mom thanked me for paying the property taxes. Every spring when Brandon called asking if I knew a good roofing contractor. Every summer when another repair suddenly became an emergency. Had I been helping my family, or had I been financing someone else's future? By 6:30 the next morning, I had turned my dining table into something that looked more like an audit room than an apartment. 3 binders, a laptop, a calculator, yellow legal pads, stacks of bank statements, receipts sorted by year. If there was one thing banking had taught me, it was this: people remember conversations. Paper remembers facts. I started with the oldest records I could find. The first major expense appeared 9 years earlier. A new furnace. $8, $460. I remembered that winter perfectly. Mom had called crying because the heating system failed during one of the coldest weeks of January. Brandon's contracting business had barely survived its first year. "I'll pay you back," Mom had promised. I never asked her to. The next year came storm damage. Insurance covered part of the roof, the remaining balance $11,900. Mine. Then came foundation drainage, electrical updates, tree removal after high winds, property taxes when Mom's retirement account had a bad year, a new water heater, exterior painting, driveway resurfacing. The numbers kept growing. Not dramatically, quietly, year after year. By lunchtime, I had entered every payment into a spreadsheet. The total sat on my screen. $183,742.16. I stared at it. $183,000. I hadn't realized it was that much. No wonder it never felt overwhelming. It hadn't happened all at once. It had happened one request at a time, one crisis, one favor, one promise that things would be different next year. I closed my eyes. Dad used to say something whenever Brandon and I argued as kids. "Families don't keep score." Back then he meant love shouldn't be transactional. He never meant one person should quietly carry everyone else forever. My phone rang. "Olivia. Tell me you found something." "I found more than I wanted." "How much?" I read her the total. There was a long pause. "Teresa." "I know." "No, listen carefully." "I'm listening." "Forget the amount." I frowned. "What?" "The money matters emotionally." "It doesn't legally, not automatically." I hated that answer. But Teresa paying for improvements doesn't usually create ownership rights. I leaned back. "So I have nothing." I didn't say that. It feels like it. That's why we're meeting Ethan. An hour later, Olivia and I walked into the office of Ethan Collins. His practice focused almost entirely on real estate disputes, estate planning, and property litigation. He looked exactly like the kind of attorney people trusted with expensive problems. Gray hair, calm voice, no dramatic speeches, just careful questions. He spent nearly 40 minutes reading everything without interruption. Occasionally he wrote notes. Occasionally he asked for dates. Nothing more. Finally he folded his hands. "I have good news." I blinked. "There is good news." "Several things." I almost laughed. "Please start there." He nodded toward the spreadsheet. "This proves you invested substantial money into the property." I was hoping that meant something. "It does. But it doesn't automatically make you an owner." I exhaled slowly. He continued. "Courts generally don't transfer ownership simply because someone paid expenses. So everything I contributed may show reliance, intent, expectations, or unjust enrichment." He paused. "But ownership is established differently." I nodded. That part made sense. Property law wasn't built on feelings, it was built on documents. "So where do we go from here?" Ethan leaned forward. "We stop looking only at money." "What should we look for?" "Conversations." I frowned. Conversations. Emails. Texts. Letters. He smiled slightly. People are remarkably honest in writing when they don't think they're creating evidence. That sentence stayed with me. Olivia suddenly asked, "Teresa, how did your mother usually describe your financial help?" I thought about it. She thanked me. No, I mean the actual words. I searched my memory, then something surfaced. She used to call it... I stopped. What? An investment. Olivia and Ethan looked at each other. Do you still have those emails? Ethan asked. I don't know. Find them. I opened my laptop. My inbox contained almost 90,000 emails. Most people would have given up immediately. Instead, I searched one word. Investment. Hundreds appeared. Wrong kind. Investment newsletters, retirement accounts, market updates. I added another search term. From Evelyn Peters. Now only 7 results remained. The 4th email froze me. Subject: thank you again. It had been sent almost 6 years earlier, after I paid for replacing the roof. I opened it. The message was short. Teresa, I know this is another big expense, but thank you for investing in our family home. One day you'll understand why keeping this place safe matters for all of us. Love, Mom. I read it again, then a 3rd time. Ethan quietly asked, anything else? I searched for family home. Another email, then another. One mentioned property taxes. Another discussed replacing windows. Then one from 4 years earlier. I appreciate you treating the house like your own investment instead of just helping me. I could never have done this without you. The room became very quiet. Ethan reached for the printed copies. This, he tapped the page gently, is significantly more interesting. It is. Very. Why? Because language matters. I wasn't sure I understood. He explained patiently. These emails don't transfer ownership. I figured, but they may demonstrate your mother's understanding that your financial contributions weren't ordinary gifts. So if this ever becomes a dispute, intent becomes relevant. Hope flickered for the first time all week. Small, careful, but real. Then Ethan asked another question. When your father passed away, I nodded. Did he have a lawyer? Yes. Estate plan? I think so. Trust? I'm not sure. He picked up his pen again. I'd like to know. I frowned. What difference would that make now? Maybe none. Maybe. Or maybe your father documented exactly what he wanted to happen to this property. The possibility hit me like cold air. Dad had been meticulous. He balanced checkbooks by hand even after online banking existed. He labeled every storage box. He kept receipts for appliances older than Brandon. If anyone had made a long-term plan, it would have been him. Ethan wrote down the name of the attorney's firm from the probate paperwork. If the office still exists, request every estate planning document they retained. What if there aren't any? Then we cross it off the list. And if there are... He looked directly at me. Families often remember conversations. He tapped the emails. Lawyers preserve intentions. I left his office carrying fewer answers than I wanted, but something far more valuable. Direction. Instead of wondering whether my family had betrayed me, I now had specific places to look. Specific questions to ask. Specific documents to find. As Olivia and I reached the parking garage, my phone vibrated again. Another message from my mother. Don't forget dinner tonight. Brandon has some ideas about the house we'd like to discuss. I showed Olivia. She read it once, then looked back at me. They're finally ready to tell you something. I slipped the phone into my purse. Maybe.
You don't sound convinced.
I'm not. Why? I looked toward the courthouse across the street. Because I have a feeling they're only planning to tell me the version of the story they think I can still change. And before I sat down at that dinner table, I intended to find out whether my late father had already left behind a version they couldn't. I canceled dinner, not permanently, just long enough to find out whether my father had left behind something more reliable than anyone's memory. When my mother texted asking if everything was all right, I blamed work. That wasn't entirely a lie. At that point, uncovering the truth had become the most important work I had. The next morning, I drove to a brick office building in Worthington that looked as though it hadn't changed since the late 1990s. A polished brass plaque beside the entrance read, "Harrison, Cole, and Whitman, Attorneys at Law." It was the same firm that had handled my father's probate case 14 years earlier. I almost expected someone to tell me the records were gone. Instead, the receptionist smiled politely after checking my identification. "You're Teresa Peters?"
Yes. You spoke with our records department yesterday.
I did.
We've located several archived files related to your father's estate.
She disappeared into the back office. A few minutes later, an older man in a navy suit approached me.
"I'm David Harrison."
I shook it.
"My father worked with your firm."
"He did."
"He passed away a long time ago."
Mr. Harrison nodded gently. "I remember Michael Peters." That surprised me. "You do." He believed paperwork should never leave questions for his family. For reasons I couldn't explain, that sentence immediately made my throat tighten. It sounded exactly like Dad. Mr. Harrison led me into a conference room. Several archive boxes already sat on the table.
"I should explain something before we begin," he said. "The probate process was completed years ago." "I understand."
"But your father also completed a number of estate planning documents before his illness." I looked at the boxes. "I didn't know that." "Most clients don't discuss every document with their children." He carefully opened the first file. Inside were documents I recognized: his will, financial statements, insurance information. Nothing unexpected. The second box was different. Bright-colored tabs divided the folders into categories: property, retirement, trust planning, personal letters. My eyes stopped on the words trust planning.
"I thought he never created one."
Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses.
"He tried." "Tried."
"Yes." He handed me a folder. Across the top, someone had written in blue ink, "Peters Family Living Trust. Draft. Not executed." Exactly as Ethan had predicted. I slowly turned the first page. Dad had intended to transfer the house into a revocable family trust. If completed, both Brandon and I would eventually become equal beneficiaries after Mom's lifetime occupancy. The trust would also have required agreement from an independent successor trustee before the property could be transferred outside the trust. I looked up. So, if this had been signed, the current situation would likely be very different. My chest tightened. "Why wasn't it?" Mr. Harrison hesitated.
"I can only answer from our records." "I understand."
He opened another folder. A meeting summary, handwritten notes. Then he pointed to one paragraph. "Client wishes to proceed. Spouse requests additional time before signing. Another meeting, same result. Another. Then finally matter closed. Trust not executed at spouse's request." I stared at the page. It wasn't dramatic. No accusation. No argument. Just a quiet record that my mother had chosen not to move forward. I felt strangely numb. Not furious. Just sad. Dad had tried to build something that protected everyone. It simply never happened. Mr. Harrison watched me silently for a moment.
Would you like some water?
I nodded. When he returned, he placed another thin folder beside me.
There's something else.
I looked at the label. Personal correspondence. Your father occasionally left letters with estate documents.
He wrote letters. Not many.
Are these addressed to me? Some are. My hands suddenly felt unsteady. I opened the folder. The first letter wasn't sealed. It wasn't a farewell letter. It had clearly been written months before Dad became seriously ill. His handwriting filled 2 pages. He talked about ordinary things. How proud he was that I'd accepted my first banking internship. How Brandon was finally finding confidence working with his hands. Then halfway down the second page, one paragraph caught my attention. You've always carried responsibility more easily than your brother. That's one of the things I admire most about you. My only concern is that people sometimes mistake responsibility for endless capacity. Promise me you'll build your own life before you spend it holding everyone else's together. I stopped reading. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I hadn't remembered those words. Maybe he'd never actually given me the letter. Maybe he'd planned to. Maybe life simply interrupted. Either way, there it was, 14 years later. A warning. Not about money, about me. Mr. Harrison quietly left the room, giving me privacy. I finished reading the rest. There was nothing about secret inheritances, nothing about hidden ownership, nothing dramatic. Just a father who knew his daughter well enough to recognize a weakness she didn't even know she had. I made copies of everything Ethan had requested: the draft trust, the meeting notes, the letters, the attorney's internal memoranda. As I organized the papers, one small yellow sticky note slipped from between 2 folders. It had probably been attached years ago. Typed in small print were 6 words: "See client memorandum dated June 18th. I frowned. I hadn't seen anything dated June 18. I searched through the folders again. Nothing. I walked back to Mr. Harrison's office. "Excuse me."
Yes. I found this.
He looked at the note. His expression changed.
What?
There should be another memorandum. It isn't here.
No.
He stood immediately.
It isn't.
He disappeared into the records room. Several minutes passed. When he returned, he was carrying a much thinner archive folder. I apologize. It was misplaced.
It appears this supplemental file was stored separately years ago.
He opened it carefully. Inside was only one document: a memorandum prepared by the attorney after his final meeting with my father. Mr. Harrison scanned it first, then looked at me. "I think your attorney will want a copy of this."
Why?
"It documents your father's reasoning." He slid the memorandum across the table. I read slowly. It explained why Dad wanted the trust. He wasn't worried about taxes. He wasn't trying to avoid probate. He feared exactly one thing: that after his death, one child would quietly become responsible for supporting the household, while the other eventually inherited the greatest benefit. I felt my heart pound. He had seen it. Even then, before any of it happened, before I paid the first property tax, before I bought the first furnace, before I replaced the roof, before Brandon ever asked for help. Dad had worried that I would sacrifice out of love, and that no one would notice how much it eventually cost me. There was one final paragraph. It wasn't legally binding. It wasn't part of the will, but it felt heavier than every official document I'd read all week. If circumstances ever prevent this trust from being completed, I hope my family remembers that fairness is measured over a lifetime, not during a single conversation. I closed the file. My eyes burned, not from anger, from grief, because for the first time since all of this had begun, I realized I wasn't simply uncovering what my family had done. I was discovering what my father had spent his final months trying to prevent. As I thanked Mr. Harrison and walked toward the parking lot, my phone buzzed. It was Ethan. "I've been reviewing the documents you emailed. You already read them, most of them. And..." There was a pause. "Teresa." His voice sounded different. "What is it?" "I think your father left us something much more valuable than a draft trust." "What?" "That memorandum changes how I want to approach this case." I stopped beside my car. "Changes it how?" "It tells me your mother wasn't the only person making decisions back then." "What do you mean?" "I need to verify one detail before I say anything else." "What detail?" "The identity of the attorney who prepared the current transfer documents." I frowned. "Why, if I'm right..." He paused again. "Someone involved in today's paperwork may have known exactly why your father's trust was never completed." I didn't start my car. I just stood there in the parking lot with Ethan's last sentence echoing in my head. "Someone involved in today's paperwork may have known exactly why your father's trust was never completed." That wasn't an accusation. It was a possibility. And after everything I'd uncovered over the past few days, I had learned not to confuse possibilities with facts. I called him back before leaving the parking lot. "What made you think that..." "I'm looking at 2 different timelines," Ethan replied. "One from 14 years ago, one from this month. And they overlap in an interesting way." "I don't follow." "The law firm that prepared Brandon's transfer documents is small. So, small firms often hire experienced attorneys from other offices." I leaned against my car. "You think someone moved firms?" "I don't know yet." "You said you wanted to verify something." "I do." "What?" "The attorney's employment history." I looked across the nearly empty parking lot. "If you're wrong, then we've lost 20 minutes. And if you're right, we may better understand why this transfer was structured the way it was." It wasn't the dramatic revelation television lawyers always seem to produce. It was simply another thread, another fact to verify, another reason not to rush. "I'll call you this afternoon," Ethan said. "I'll be waiting." Back at my apartment, I spread every document across the dining table again. The trust draft, Dad's memorandum, the quitclaim deed, the filing timeline, the emails Mom had sent over the years. Individually, they told different stories. Together, they painted a family that had slowly drifted into an arrangement nobody had ever openly discussed. Mom had relied on me. Brandon had benefited from that reliance, and I had accepted the role without asking where it eventually ended. The more I looked at the documents, the more one question kept returning. Why had the insurance company contacted me? If Brandon believed I had no interest in the property anymore, why hadn't the change simply gone through? I picked up the phone and called the insurance company listed in the notification. After verifying my ID, I was transferred to a senior policy specialist named Melissa. "Ms. Peters, how can I help you today?" "I received a notification that someone requested changes to a homeowner's policy." "I see the file." "I'd like to understand what happened." Melissa was careful with her wording. "There are limits to what I can disclose." "I understand." "But I received the notification."
"Yes."
She paused while reviewing the account. "I can explain the process."
"Please."
When someone requests significant changes to a homeowner's policy, especially involving occupancy or insured interests, our system compares the request with prior records. I wrote that down. Our records showed previous communications involving your email address. My email. Yes. I've never owned the policy. Ownership isn't the only factor. That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" For several years, premium notices, contractor documentation, and repair invoices listed your contact information. I remembered immediately. Whenever Mom needed help with insurance claims after storms or repairs, she'd ask me to speak with adjusters because I understood paperwork better than she did. Apparently, those years had created a history inside the insurance system. Melissa continued, "When the recent request stated that you no longer had any involvement with the property, our verification software identified conflicting historical information. So the request wasn't approved. Not automatically. What happens now? We requested additional documentation." "From whom?" "The individual submitting the changes." "Brandon." "I can't confirm names." "Fair enough. But yes," she added carefully, "additional verification is still pending." I thanked her before hanging up. That conversation didn't prove anyone had committed fraud, but it proved something equally important. The system had noticed an inconsistency before I did. Sometimes technology catches patterns people overlook. An hour later, Ethan called. "I have an update. I'm listening." "The attorney who prepared Brandon's paperwork wasn't involved in your father's trust. So we were wrong." "Not entirely." "What do you mean?" "The senior partner wasn't." "And?" "The paralegal who assembled the file used to work for Harrison, Cole, and Whitman." I blinked. "The same firm?" "Yes." I wasn't sure what to make of that. "Does it matter?" "Probably not legally, but it means someone familiar with your family's old estate file may have recognized the names." "You think they remembered?" "I have no idea." He chuckled softly. "I'm telling you because I don't want either of us making assumptions." That was one of the things I appreciated most about Ethan. He never tried to force evidence into a convenient story. If something mattered, he explained why. If it didn't, he let it go. "I do have something more useful," he continued. "What's that?" "The insurance records." "I already spoke with them." "Good." "Why?" "Because I requested the activity log." "You can do that." "With your authorization." "I signed it yesterday." "I know." "What did it show?" "There were 3 contacts. I only knew about one." "The first request was submitted online." "Okay." "The second was a follow-up phone call." "And the third?" He paused. "The third request was withdrawn." I sat upright. "Withdrawn?" "Yes." "By who?" "I don't know yet." "Why would someone withdraw it?" "I've been wondering the same thing." That changed everything. If Brandon truly believed the transfer would succeed, why back away from the insurance request? Unless... "No." I said it out loud without realizing. "What?" "They learned something." "What?" "I don't know." But something made them stop. Ethan didn't answer immediately. "I think you're asking the right question." Before hanging up, he gave me one piece of advice. "Teresa." "Yes." "Don't let the paperwork distract you from people." "What do you mean, documents explain decisions? People explain motives." That evening, my mother called again. This time I answered. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hi, Mom." "You've been busy." "Work." "I understand." There was a short silence. Then she asked casually, "Are we still on for dinner tomorrow?" I looked at the stack of papers beside me. "I think so." "Good." "I've missed talking to you." "I've missed talking too." She sounded completely normal, warm, gentle, like every other conversation we'd had over the years. If I hadn't heard her whisper on Sunday, if I hadn't seen the paperwork, if I hadn't uncovered Dad's memorandum, I would have believed every word. Instead, I listened differently, not for lies, for omissions. Before ending the call, Mom added one sentence that stayed with me long after we hung up. Oh, and don't worry about the house. She laughed softly. Brandon's just trying to help me organize a few things. I quietly replied, I'm glad he's helping. But after the call ended, I opened my notebook and wrote one more line beneath the growing timeline. Wednesday, 7:42 p.m. Mom voluntarily mentioned the house before I asked a single question. People often reveal what weighs on their conscience, not because they're questioned, because silence makes them fill the space. As I closed the notebook, another email appeared from Ethan. Attached was the insurance activity log. I opened the final page. Most of it matched what we'd already discussed. Then my eyes stopped on the very last entry. Verification request closed by applicant pending future resubmission. Not denied. Not approved. Postponed. Someone hadn't abandoned the plan. Someone was waiting. The only question left was, waiting for what? I didn't bring a lawyer to dinner. I didn't bring a recorder. I didn't even bring every document I'd collected over the past week. Instead, I carried a slim leather folder with only the papers I was prepared to discuss if I absolutely had to. There was a difference between confronting someone and cornering them. I wasn't interested in humiliating my family. I wanted the truth. When I pulled into my mother's driveway Wednesday evening, Brandon's pickup truck was already there. The porch light was on. Everything looked exactly as it always had. The flower pots by the front steps, the wind chime Dad had installed years ago. The porch swing Mom still refused to replace, even though one chain squeaked every time someone sat down. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. Then I noticed something new. A keypad lock. The old deadbolt was gone. My chest tightened. They hadn't waited. They had already changed the lock. I walked up the steps anyway. Before I could knock, the door opened. Mom smiled. There you are. She hugged me. The hug felt familiar, comforting, and strangely distant at the same time. Inside, Brandon was setting plates on the dining table. Hey, sis. Hey. He sounded relaxed, almost cheerful. No one acted like anything unusual had happened. If I hadn't spent the last several days gathering evidence, I might have believed nothing had changed. Dinner began with ordinary conversation. Mom talked about her church group. Brandon complained about rising material costs for his business. I mentioned work. No one brought up the house. Not for nearly 30 minutes. Finally, Mom folded her napkin. Teresa? Yes. Brandon has been helping me think about the future. I nodded. I'm glad. She smiled, relieved that I hadn't interrupted. You know this house is getting harder for me to manage. I do. I'm not getting younger. I know. She looked toward Brandon before continuing. We've been discussing long-term plans. I waited. Brandon leaned forward. I've been thinking about moving in. That makes sense, I said calmly. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Apparently, that wasn't the response he'd expected. Mom continued. If someone lived here full-time, I'd feel safer. I understand. And eventually, she hesitated. The house should stay in the family. It should. Another pause. Brandon finally said it. We've been talking to an attorney. I nodded once. I know. The room became very still. Mom blinked. What do you mean? I visited the recorder's office yesterday. Neither of them spoke. I reached into my folder and placed one sheet of paper on the table. Not the deed. Not Dad's memorandum. Just the public filing receipt. Brandon looked at it, then at me. You searched the records? Yes. Mom's face lost color. I was going to explain. Were you? Of course. When? She looked down at her hands. We just needed everything organized first. I didn't argue. Instead, I asked the simplest question I could think of. When were you planning to tell me? Neither answered. Silence can be surprisingly loud around a dinner table. Finally, Brandon spoke. You always assume the worst. I don't. You do. He leaned back. This isn't some conspiracy. Then help me understand. Mom inhaled slowly. I wanted Brandon to have stability. I know. You've always had a good career. I've worked hard for it. You'll always be okay. There it was. The sentence I'd heard in different forms my entire adult life. You'll be okay. Because I was responsible. Because I had a stable income. Because I rarely asked anyone for help. My strength had slowly become everyone else's excuse. I looked at Mom. So because I'll be okay? She lowered her eyes. You didn't think I deserved to know. She didn't answer directly. I didn't want you to worry. I almost smiled. I've spent the last week doing exactly that. Brandon cleared his throat. Teresa, let's be honest. Okay. You don't need this house. I never said I did. You have your own apartment. I do. I've got kids. I know. They need space. They do. So why fight this? I haven't fought anything. Then why investigate? Because someone whispered about changing locks after I left. Because legal notices were mailed to an address you knew I hadn't lived at in years. Because someone tried to change the insurance records before speaking to me. I could have said all of that. Instead, I asked another question. Brandon. What? Did you know I've been paying major expenses on this house for years? He hesitated. Mom told me. Did you know how much? No. I slid a second sheet across the table. Not every payment, just the summary. Roof, foundation, HVAC, property taxes, emergency plumbing, total $183,742.16. Brandon stared at the page. His expression slowly changed. I didn't know it was... He stopped. That much? He nodded. Mom looked at the paper only briefly before looking away. I never kept track, she whispered. I know. I wasn't using you. I believe you. She looked surprised. You do. I believe you never sat down one day and decided to take advantage of me. Her eyes filled with tears. But somewhere along the way, I spoke gently. It became normal for everyone to assume I'd always pay. No one argued, because no one could. Brandon rubbed the back of his neck. I honestly thought you wanted to help. I did. I never asked for all of that. I know. Those words caught him off guard. For the first time all evening, I saw something besides defensiveness, confusion, regret, maybe even shame. Mom suddenly reached across the table. I never wanted you to feel less important. I held her hand for a moment. I don't think you wanted that. Then why are we here? I slowly removed one final document from my folder. Dad's letter, not the memorandum, just the personal letter. I found something. Mom recognized the handwriting instantly. Her eyes widened. Michael? She whispered his name before unfolding the pages. She read silently. Halfway through, tears rolled down her face. Brandon leaned over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke until the last page. Finally, Mom closed the letter carefully. I never knew he wrote this. I don't think he ever gave it to me. She shook her head slowly. He always worried about you. I know. He used to tell me... She couldn't finish. Instead, she covered her mouth. The room was quiet again. Not tense this time. Heavy. Grief has a different silence than conflict. After several minutes, Mom finally looked at me. There was something else. I waited. I need to tell you the truth.
I didn't interrupt. I told Brandon to wait until you left before changing the locks. I know. I wasn't trying to erase you. Then why? She looked toward the front hallway. I was afraid. Of what? That if you knew we were changing them, she swallowed hard, you'd stop the transfer before Brandon had somewhere secure to live. There it was. Not greed, not hatred, fear, misguided, unfair, but honest. Brandon looked at his mother in surprise. You never told me that's why. I couldn't. He stared at the table. I thought you were worried Teresa would be angry. Mom wiped her eyes. I was worried she'd be hurt. No one spoke. Then my phone vibrated. An email from Ethan. Subject: do not sign anything tonight. New information just arrived. I looked down at the preview. Only one sentence was visible before the rest disappeared behind the notification. Teresa, the attorney representing your family, has agreed to voluntary mediation before any further property filings. I looked back up at my mother and brother. Neither of them had any idea that while we sat around the same dinner table Dad had bought nearly 20 years earlier, the legal path beneath this entire situation had just changed. I didn't mention Ethan's email, not yet. I slipped my phone face down beside my plate and let the silence settle over the table. For the first time since this began, no one was trying to convince anyone else of anything. Mom was quietly folding Dad's letter back into its envelope. Brandon hadn't touched his dinner in nearly 15 minutes. The conversation had shifted from defending decisions to living with them. Finally, Brandon spoke. I think I owe you an apology. I looked at him but said nothing. I really didn't know how much you'd paid. I believe you. I knew you helped Mom. He rubbed his forehead. I thought it was a few repairs here and there. You never asked. No, I never volunteered the numbers. He nodded slowly. That's true. Mom looked at both of us. I should have told him. Neither of us answered. Because that much was obvious. Brandon looked back at me. When Mom first mentioned transferring the house, he stopped. She said you wouldn't want it. I frowned. She told you that? He nodded. She said you loved your apartment downtown. I do. She said you'd probably tell her to keep the house. I probably would have. Mom looked confused. You would have. Of course. She blinked. Then why? Because you never asked. The room fell quiet again. That sentence landed harder than I expected. For years, our family had been making decisions based on assumptions instead of conversations. Mom assumed I'd always help. Brandon assumed I didn't care about the house. I assumed honesty didn't need to be requested inside a family. Every assumption had quietly become another brick in the wall between us. I finally picked up my phone. I received an email a few minutes ago. Mom looked uneasy. From who? My attorney. Brandon frowned. You hired a lawyer. I consulted one. Teresa? Mom's voice carried disappointment more than anger. You didn't trust us. I met her eyes. You asked Brandon to wait until I left before changing the locks. She lowered her gaze. I know. I found transfer documents at the recorder's office. I know. I discovered legal notices were sent to an address you knew I hadn't lived at in years. Mom closed her eyes. I know. So yes, I spoke quietly. I hired a lawyer. No one argued. Instead, I opened the email. It says your attorney has agreed to voluntary mediation before filing anything else. Brandon looked surprised. My attorney, so you knew. He hesitated. I knew Mom hired someone. You never spoke with him. Once. What did he tell you? That mediation would be cheaper than litigation. Mom looked confused. I thought he was just delaying paperwork.
I shook my head. No. I turned the phone toward them. He's asking everyone to meet before any additional documents are filed. Brandon exhaled slowly.
Maybe that's for the best.
It was the first thing he'd said all evening that sounded completely sincere. 3 days later, all 4 of us sat inside a mediation office on the 10th floor of a downtown Columbus building. The room didn't look like a courtroom. There were no raised benches, no witness stand, just a large oval table, coffee, water, yellow legal pads. The mediator, Judith Marshall, was in her 60s, calm, patient, the kind of person who had clearly spent decades watching families struggle to say the things they should have said years earlier. She began with one rule: "We're not here to determine who's the better person." She looked around the room. "We're here to determine whether this conflict can be resolved before someone else decides it for you." That immediately changed the atmosphere. Nobody had come to win, at least not in the usual sense. Ethan spoke first. He summarized the timeline without exaggeration. The financial contributions, the pending transfer, the insurance request, the draft trust, Dad's memorandum. He never raised his voice. He simply arranged facts in chronological order. When he finished, Judith turned toward Brandon's attorney, a younger man named Scott Reynolds. Scott didn't immediately argue. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and said something I hadn't expected.
"We acknowledge Miss Peters' financial contributions."
I looked at Brandon. He looked just as surprised. Scott continued.
"We also acknowledge that Mr. Brandon Peters benefited from improvements funded primarily by his sister."
Brandon nodded once.
"Yes."
There it was. The first formal acknowledgement. Not from my mother, not from Brandon, from the attorney representing their interests. Judith wrote something on her notepad. Then she asked Brandon directly,
"When did you first become aware of the extent of Teresa's financial support?"
Brandon answered honestly.
"Last Wednesday.
When she showed you the spreadsheet, yes."
"Were you aware she had replaced the roof?" "I knew." "The HVAC system?" "I knew." "The taxes?"
"No."
"The foundation work?"
"No."
"The total amount?"
"No."
Judith nodded thoughtfully.
"Did knowing those facts change your perspective?" Brandon didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said,
"Yes."
"How?" I realized. He stopped. I'd been thinking about the house as something Mom owned. And I never thought about everything Teresa had quietly done to keep it standing. He looked toward me. "I'm sorry." There wasn't a dramatic speech after that. No tears, no music, just one sentence. "I'm sorry." Sometimes that's enough to begin, not enough to repair, but enough to begin. Then Judith turned toward my mother. "Evelyn." Mom looked exhausted.
"Yes."
"Why didn't you tell Teresa your plans before preparing transfer documents?" Mom stared at the table. "Because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That she'd say no." Judith asked the obvious follow-up. "If you believed she had no interest in the house?" Mom slowly looked up. "Then why were you afraid she'd stop it?" The room became completely silent. Even Scott stopped writing. Mom didn't answer immediately because there wasn't an easy answer. Finally, she whispered, "I knew she deserved to know." No one interrupted. Her voice broke. "I kept telling myself I'd explain after everything was finished." Judith nodded gently. "Many families convince themselves that avoiding one difficult conversation is an act of kindness." Mom wiped her eyes. "It wasn't." "No, it was fear." Judith smiled sadly. "Usually it is." After a short break, Ethan requested permission to distribute one final document. Not Dad's memorandum, not the trust. A simple timeline. One page, left column. Every major expense I'd paid over the previous 9 years. Right column, the dates when discussions about transferring the house had first begun. The overlap was impossible to ignore. Year after year, while I continued investing in the property, plans were gradually forming to transfer it entirely to Brandon. Scott studied the page for nearly a minute. Then he quietly pushed it back across the table. I don't dispute the chronology. Judith looked at him. Do you dispute the facts?
No.
She turned toward Brandon. Do you... He slowly shook his head.
No.
Then something happened that I hadn't anticipated. Brandon turned completely toward me.
I need you to hear this.
I nodded.
I knew you helped. I know. But I let myself believe helping meant you didn't mind.
I remained silent.
That was easier than asking whether it was fair.
He swallowed hard.
And that wasn't fair.
For the first time since all of this had begun, I believed he wasn't speaking because an attorney had advised him to. He was speaking because he had finally allowed himself to see the situation from outside his own needs. Judith closed her notebook. I think we're making progress. But before anyone could respond, Scott cleared his throat.
There's one issue we still need to address.
Everyone looked toward him. He opened a folder and slid a document into the center of the table. I received this from my client this morning. I frowned. It wasn't one of Ethan's documents. It wasn't one of mine. Across the top in my mother's handwriting was a title I had never seen before. Family Contribution Ledger. Mom's eyes widened. I forgot that still existed. I looked at her. What is it? She stared at the notebook as though seeing it for the first time in years. Quietly, almost to herself, she whispered, I've been keeping records. Much longer than any of you realize. No one reached for the notebook. Not immediately. It sat in the middle of the mediation table, worn around the edges, its dark blue cover faded from years of being handled and stored away. I looked at my mother. You kept records. She nodded slowly. I started after your father got sick. Why, I was afraid I wouldn't remember everything. The mediator, Judith Marshall, gently slid the notebook toward Evelyn. If you're comfortable, she said, I'd like everyone to understand what it contains. Mom rested both hands on the cover before opening it.
I never intended for anyone else to read this.
Brandon frowned.
I've never seen it either.
I know. She opened to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably hers. Every page was dated. Every entry was brief. Some were only 2 or 3 sentences long. Others filled an entire page. The first few years contained ordinary reminders. Roof inspection, insurance renewal, property tax due dates, doctor's appointments. Then the entries slowly changed. Mom stopped at one page and quietly read aloud. March 14th. She swallowed. Teresa paid the furnace company today. She told me not to worry about paying her back. I told myself I'd make it up to her someday. She turned another page. September 2nd. Brandon's business is still struggling. Teresa covered the roof repair. I hate asking, but she never says no. Another page.
January 18th. Teresa paid the property taxes again. I know she says it's fine, but I wonder how long someone can keep giving before they become tired of being strong.
The room was completely silent. I wasn't hearing anything I didn't already know. I had paid those bills. What surprised me was that Mom had noticed. Every single one. She kept turning pages, year after year, entry after entry. She remembered every major repair, every emergency, every check I'd written, every time I told her not to worry. Finally, she stopped at an entry written only 11 months earlier. Her voice became barely audible. I'm afraid I've started expecting Teresa to rescue us. That frightens me because expectations become habits before anyone notices. I slowly looked up. When did you write that? She checked the date. Last fall. You already knew. Tears filled her eyes. I did. Then why didn't anything change? She closed the notebook. Because I convinced myself there was still time. No one spoke. Judith finally broke the silence. Mrs. Peters. Mom looked toward her. You've described something many parents experience. What? You slowly stopped seeing help as a sacrifice because it became reliable. Mom nodded through tears. Yes. And once that happened, Judith continued gently, you began making plans based on Teresa's reliability instead of asking what those plans would cost her, Mom whispered. Yes. There was no argument left, only honesty. Brandon leaned forward. I need to say something. Everyone turned toward him. I've spent this whole week thinking Mom favored me. He shook his head. I don't think that's exactly what happened. I waited. I think she depended on Teresa. He looked at me. And protected me. He laughed once bitterly. Neither of us actually benefited from that. Mom covered her face. I thought I was helping both of you. I know, Brandon said quietly. But I never learned to stand on my own while Teresa never got permission to stop carrying everyone else. Those words hung in the room longer than any legal argument had. For years, I had believed Brandon saw me only as the successful older sister who could afford to help. Now, I realized something else. He had grown accustomed to being protected, just as I had grown accustomed to being responsible. Neither role had been healthy. Judith looked toward Ethan. Counselor, see you. Ethan nodded. My client has never asked this court or this mediation to give her ownership of the property. Scott looked surprised. You haven't, I answered before Ethan could. No. Brandon frowned. Then what do you want? It was the question everyone should have asked from the beginning. I took a slow breath. I want the truth acknowledged. No one interrupted. I want no more legal filings made behind my back. I looked at my mother. I want no more decisions based on what people assume I'll accept. Then I looked at Brandon. And I will never again finance problems that aren't mine to solve. The words came out calmly, not angrily, not dramatically, simply as facts. Mom wiped her eyes. So, you're not asking for the house? I smiled sadly. No. She looked genuinely confused. After everything, I was never fighting for the house. I glanced toward Dad's letter lying beside my folder. I was fighting for respect. No one spoke for several seconds. Judith finally smiled. I think that's the clearest statement we've heard all day. Scott closed his notebook. My clients are prepared to withdraw the pending transfer. I looked at Brandon. He nodded before his attorney finished speaking. I already told him to. Mom turned toward him in surprise. You did. This morning. You never told me. I wanted to. He looked at me. But I wanted Teresa to hear it first. For the first time since Sunday afternoon, I felt the weight on my chest ease. Not disappear. Just become lighter. Ethan spoke next. We've drafted a settlement proposal. Judith handed copies around the table. It contained only a few pages. Simple. Clear. The pending deed transfer would be permanently withdrawn. No future transfer of the property would occur without independent legal advice for Evelyn. Teresa would have no future financial obligation related to the home. All prior financial contributions would be recognized as voluntary family support, not future obligations. There would be no reimbursement, No ownership claim, no continuing expectation, clean boundaries, nothing more, nothing less. Mom looked up after reading the final page. You really don't want anything from me. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over hers. I do. What? I want you to stop believing love has to come from the child who's least likely to say no. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. I don't know if you'll ever forgive me. I thought carefully before answering. I already have. She looked relieved. Then I continued. But forgiveness isn't the same thing as going back to how things were. She slowly nodded. I understand. I won't be paying for the house anymore. I know. I won't be solving every emergency. I know. I'll still be your daughter. Her voice cracked. I'd like that. I smiled. So would I. As everyone gathered their papers, Ethan quietly stepped beside me. You did well. I feel exhausted. That's normal. I glanced toward my mother and Brandon, who were talking softly near the window. I don't think we'll ever be the family we were. He followed my gaze. Maybe not. Then he smiled. But sometimes that's exactly what healing requires. 6 months later, I drove past my mother's house without stopping. Not because I wasn't welcome, because I no longer felt responsible for checking whether everything was all right. That difference may sound small. It wasn't. For most of my adult life, I measured love by how useful I could be. If the furnace stopped working, I called contractors. If property taxes were due, I paid them. If the roof leaked, I found the money. If Brandon ran into another difficult season, I quietly rearranged my own plans before anyone had to ask. I believed I was keeping my family together. Looking back, I realize I was also keeping an unhealthy pattern alive. The mediation agreement had been finalized 2 weeks after our last meeting. As promised, Brandon's attorney formally withdrew the pending property transfer. The quitclaim deed was never recorded. The request to change the homeowner's insurance policy was permanently canceled. Evelyn remained the sole legal owner of the house exactly as she had been before. No hidden transfers, no quiet paperwork, no last-minute surprises. Just a written agreement that every future decision involving the property would be made openly and with independent legal advice. When Ethan called to tell me everything had been completed, he didn't congratulate me. Instead, he asked one simple question. Yeah. What are you going to do with all the energy you've spent taking care of everyone else? I laughed. I honestly don't know. Find out. That conversation stayed with me. For years, every extra dollar I earned had already been assigned before it reached my checking account. Mom might need something. Brandon might need something. The house almost certainly needed something. For the first time in years, no one was waiting for my paycheck except me. A month later, I started looking at houses. Not because I needed to prove anything, not because I wanted to replace my childhood home, because I wanted a place that represented a life I had built without guilt attached to it. After several weekends of open houses, I found it. A modest brick home on a quiet street just outside Dublin, Ohio. 3 bedrooms, a small office overlooking the backyard, a front porch just big enough for 2 rocking chairs. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to impress anyone. When I signed the closing documents, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not excitement, relief. Every signature I placed on those papers represented a decision that belonged entirely to me. No family pressure, no obligation, no hidden expectations, just my choice. Olivia came over the weekend after I moved in carrying 2 boxes. One held kitchen towels, the other held a small maple tree. A housewarming gift, she said. I laughed. You brought me a tree. You've spent years helping maintain someone else's home. She pointed toward the backyard. I thought you deserved to plant something that would actually grow with yours. We planted it together that afternoon. While we worked, she asked the question everyone else had been avoiding. How are things with your mom? I thought about it. Better. Really different. I explained that we now spoke once a week instead of almost every day. She no longer called asking me to solve every problem. Sometimes she simply called to ask how I was doing. The first few conversations felt awkward, almost like we were learning how to be mother and daughter instead of manager and rescuer, but they were honest, and honesty had become more valuable than comfort. What about Brandon? Olivia asked. I smiled. He's surprising me. A month after mediation, Brandon had accepted a full-time project management position with a regional construction company. His small contracting business hadn't failed. He had simply admitted he couldn't keep carrying all the financial uncertainty alone. It was the first major decision I'd ever seen him make without asking someone else to absorb the risk. One Saturday afternoon, he stopped by my new house. He brought a toolbox. I figured every homeowner needs one. I laughed. I thought you were coming to build me a deck. He grinned. No. Why not? Because if I build everything for you, he paused. I'll never stop treating you the way Mom treated us. I looked at him. So you're giving me tools instead? Exactly. He shrugged. I'll teach you if you want. We spent the afternoon installing shelves in my garage. Not because I couldn't hire someone, because siblings are allowed to help each other. They're just not supposed to become responsible for each other's entire lives. Mom visited for the first time a few weeks later. She walked slowly through every room. She admired the kitchen, the office, the backyard. Finally, she stood on the porch. I'm proud of you. I smiled. You've always said that. She shook her head. No. This time I mean something different. I waited. I'm proud of the life you've built. She took my hand. And I'm proud that you finally stopped carrying mine. Neither of us cried. We didn't need to. Some moments are too peaceful for tears. Before leaving, Mom handed me a small envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Dad, Brandon, me. Standing in front of our childhood home after we'd painted the fence one summer. On the back in Dad's handwriting were 4 simple words. Home is the people, not the house, not the deed, not the locks, the people. For years I'd misunderstood that sentence. I thought protecting the people meant sacrificing myself. Now I understood something different. Healthy families don't survive because one person keeps giving until there's nothing left. They survive because everyone learns where love ends and respect begins. Today, I still visit my mother. I still have dinner with Brandon and his family. I adore my nieces. I'll always be their aunt. But when the conversation turns to money, property, or obligations, the answer is simple. We'll figure out a fair solution together. Not because I became cold, because boundaries protect relationships that guilt eventually destroys. The strangest part is this. The locks on my mother's house were changed. The deed transfer was withdrawn. The legal paperwork disappeared into filing cabinets where it belonged. Yet none of those things became the real ending. The real ending happened the first evening I locked the front door of my own home, not because I was shutting people out, but because for the first time in my life I knew exactly what I was protecting. It wasn't a building. It wasn't an investment. It wasn't even my peace. It was the quiet certainty that love should never require someone to disappear for everyone else to feel secure. For a long time, I believed that being the dependable one was simply part of who I was.
If you have spent years carrying your family financially, emotionally, or practically, you probably know how easy it is to confuse love with responsibility. The line between generosity and self-sacrifice often fades so gradually that you don't realize you've crossed it until someone expects your kindness instead of appreciating it. One of the hardest lessons I've learned is that forgiveness and access are not the same thing. You can forgive someone without handing them the keys to your finances, your home, or your peace of mind. Healthy boundaries are not punishment. They are how trust is rebuilt, if it can be rebuilt at all. Families are complicated. Most hurt doesn't begin with cruelty. It begins with assumptions. Fear avoidance, and the belief that the strongest person will always carry one more burden. But strength should never become an obligation that only one person is expected to fulfill. If this story reminded you of something you've experienced, I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you still loved? What did that journey teach you? And if you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience, justice, and healing, I hope you'll subscribe and join us for the next one. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.